And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have Curt Smith with me here from Indiana Family Institute. Curt, how are you doing this morning?
Doing great. Glad to be with you.
And so I deeply appreciate Curt and his work. You may notice he works with the Indiana Family Institute, and so do I. And so I get to work closely with Curt and just really appreciate his perspective, his years of experience in this arena. And the big question, I think, on many Christians' minds today, this week is going to be, how does this election, how do the results affect Christian citizenship? Where do we go from here? Many expected a Trump victory. It appears that right now Biden will pull it out. So where do we go next? What does it mean? And I appreciate Curt's perspective and his many years of experience. Curt has spent 40 plus years and a career in public policy. His work includes stints as an award-winning journalist, 15 years on Capitol Hill, in two senior staff roles, one with U.S. Senator Dan Coates, the other one with U.S. Rep. John Hostetler. And he also has spent more than 19, almost 20 years with Indiana Family Institute, working out how does the church engage in public life. And so I appreciate his work in this arena. And anytime I have a question about, well, where are things going politically and what should we expect? I know exactly who to contact. And so I want to get Curt on this call and get his thoughts on kind of where we're going. And so Curt, just as we jump in, election results, when I put together this outline a couple days ago, we didn't quite know, but what are your thoughts on kind of where this looks like it's headed, with the AP calling it for Joe Biden, yet Trump has said, hey, there's going to be some challenges. What are your thoughts on where this is going?
Well, I think we're going to be fine as a church and as Christian citizens. Looking at the election specifically, I think there's something for everybody in this election. And that's not all bad given the tense times we live in. It does appear that President-elect Biden will prevail. He's got about 4 million more votes than President Trump. As the count continues, we're down to just dribs and drabs. So there's going to be a wide plurality for President-elect Biden. But I think Republicans did well up and down the ticket, apart from the presidential race. And again, there, President Trump got more votes than any sitting president ever in history. He got more votes than Barack Obama. So we had a huge turnout, great participation in this constitutional republic we call America. And in some ways, it's a draw. In other ways, I think you could say it's a slight favor towards the more conservative, more biblically aware policymakers. And I can go down that list when you're kind of want to get into the weeds. But I think at the top level, there's something here for everyone. And I'm heartened that it doesn't appear God's done with America. And by my reading of the election returns, it doesn't appear America's done with God either.
That's helpful. And I did want to mention to the listeners, especially if you're new to the podcast, this podcast is focused on doing the hard work of gospel-centered citizenship. We believe that our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and to his kingdom. However, we believe we have a responsibility, a biblical responsibility, to engage as Christian citizens. And I often talk about things like foster care, the drug crisis, but because we live in a primarily two-party system, it might be nice to be in kind of a proportional system like Europe. Some of the decisions would be, I think, a little easier. But we engage in the here and now, the system that we have. And so today, just to be helpful, I wanted to go ahead and let's dive right in. As we pursue biblical principles, we've talked about kind of a star-shaped public witness for the church. As we pursue those, they lead us to certain conclusions. And so if Biden is going to be the president, Curt, what are your thoughts? What are some key things that Christian citizens should be thinking about? And I'm going to follow this up with a question about, if Trump were still to be in office, there'd be some things we should think about as well. So President-elect, barring any major court action, Joe Biden, what are some thoughts with the policies that he's proposed? What are some things we should be thinking about?
I think we begin with earnest and passionate prayer for President Biden. We want him to be successful. He appears to be headed toward being the president for all of the country. For an additional reason, this might sound a little cynical to some, but I fear his running mate, Kamala Harris's policies more than I do Joe Biden's. And so I hope he has the opportunity to have a vigorous and full presidency. because I think Senator Harris, now Vice President-elect Harris, would be a more challenging leader for the church. I would expect there to be efforts to erode religious liberty. There would be legislation likely proposed in the House, perhaps passed, maybe considered in the Senate, depending on where things end up, that would force Catholic hospitals to perform abortions, or to require Christian universities to allow same-sex couples to live in their married housing, things like that. Kind of the issues that were sort of settled in the last decade with some pretty strong Supreme Court rulings. But I would imagine that a Biden-Harris administration will come back with a more progressive House and try to pass some laws, at least put some markers down for some of their key constituencies. I think the church should respond winsomely, confidently, boldly. We don't have to apologize for our faith. Fortunately, it's protected in America. But even if it wasn't, we want to proclaim that. We want to be known as Christians first. But I think we'll have a better environment if President Biden is really calling the shots than if others in his coalition or his constituency are in charge of things.
So I have two follow-ups on that, but just for the listeners' benefits, I deeply respect Curt, and when he says respond winsomely and boldly, he speaks from experience. If you remember the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and it blowing up in Indiana, RFRA simply provided needed protections. It helped correct a court decision called Employment Division versus Smith. It's all it was doing, just re-elevating scrutiny for religious liberty cases. And it actually just blew up here in Indiana, if you remember that story. Ended up costing Curt things professionally, as well as I can't even imagine the firestorm that you went through. So when you say that, it is not just, even me saying it, it is somebody that has been in the trenches and in the firestorm. So I appreciate
I got some scars. So, but God is good, and He has used that experience not only in my own life, but certainly it helped elevate Mike Pence to the vice presidency, how he navigated those tough things. I didn't agree with his final decision, but I thought the way he handled himself was pretty winsome and was a credit to the gospel. And I think it helped put him on the ticket. So yeah, we need as the church to be bold and confident and speak truth into this culture. But again, I think this election gives us some hope and some heart. We kept up with the other side stride for stride. And I'm not pitting this as, Christians versus the devil. I mean, there's two worldviews tugging it out here. One is theocratic. We see God at the center, and we believe that his ideas, his principles can help us order our public life. The other side, generally, to oversimplify, doesn't believe that. And they think government should make these decisions and calls. And we really are at a point where on everything below the president, the more conservative side, the more biblical side, to again oversimplify, came out ahead. We gained some seats in the U.S. House. That was not expected by any pundits or observers. We've probably only lost 1 or 2 seats in the Senate, and will likely keep it. And that's huge. And then if you go down the ballot, we gained several state legislative seats around the country. We didn't lose any chambers. And every 10 years, the election has kind of an extra bonus. It's called redistricting. After the census in April 1 of the new decade, this year was 2020, we reapportion the electoral votes. And there's going to be no less than 3 come out of blue states, New York, Illinois, and California, and go to Texas and Florida. There could be 5 or 6, depending on where people were on Census Day, April 1st. The pandemic upended that too. So I think in many ways you could say the D's got the presidency, it appears at this time. The R's got all the everything below the ballot from there. And that's not a bad outcome in this process, and it will help give the church time to be bold, to refine its message, to find its way in the public square when it's contentious and controversial.
There were 2 particular pieces one piece of legislation, one promised action that certainly gives me pause. And it would give me pause if it came from President Biden or from President Trump, President-elect Biden, President Trump. And that is one, the Equality Act, which you've mentioned already, which would essentially give protected status to sexual orientation, gender identity. And as proposed, that law contains very, very few religious exemptions. In fact, kind of none at all. You might expect that some would
Right.
be hammered out. And then certainly President-elect Biden has said that he would support the transition of an 8-year-old child. And then I think the thing that probably gives me the most pause is the promise to basically stack the court, or at least he refused to say he would not stack the court, which could have profound effects on religious liberty for ministries and Christians. Would you comment on that?
Sure. Well, let me start with the courts, because one of the true legacies of Trump's 4-year presidency is a restoration of the courts toward a more constitutional view. And it's kind of ironic, a lot of people think, well, conservatives are now going to win all the cases they want because they've got these judges at the district appellate and especially at the Supreme Court level. No, we're just trying to restore this equilibrium in our check and balance system where the actual text passed, or the amendments agreed to, or the text of the Constitution, that's how we're going to govern ourselves. That was the compact that people made with their legislators at the time. And I think any court stacking will really be a problem for the church, because we have won some significant religious liberty guarantees. But just in general, I think it'll be a crazy problem for our country. We rely on the rule of law. We rely on precedent. Lots of people make decisions every day, from how they're going to lead their family to how they're going to invest in a new business or a startup or an existing business. And if all those rules are jump ball every time a new president's elected, you can't really organize your life for a long-term view, whether, again, it's raising children or investing. So I think any effort to stack the court will be a big, big problem for the church. I hope it blows up in the faces of whomever tries it. It did back in the 30s when FDR, former President Franklin Roosevelt, proposed it. The public recoiled from that, and I hope that would happen here. Regarding the Equality Act, that's a problem. The other side argues, well, wait a minute, we should be able to force people to get along, kind of coerce cooperation. And the Christian community wants to get along. We want to serve everyone. We don't want to be a bad witness or lead someone away from the gospel. But there are some things that cut at who you are and what you believe. And if you're creating a Christian school and people want to flood it with a lot of kids who don't share that worldview, that makes it very hard to organize the school and hire the staff and do the things you need to do. And they have an option in the public school. They can go to other schools. That's called freedom. It's messy, but that's freedom. And the same should be for the cake baker, and on down the list it goes. So I think the Equality Act sounds good on the surface. Any public service should be available for everyone. But then it starts butting up against our beliefs, our conscience claims. And James Madison, who's viewed as the author of the United States Constitution, said the most important thing we need to protect with this document is our rights of conscience, what we think, what we believe. And so I hope those are given great deference in this new administration.
So since we've talked about that, I would mention that he has made several calls for unity and trying to work together, and I certainly appreciate that. I do hope that it plays out into again kind of we're going to allow Christians to keep living out their faith.
He even quoted Ecclesiastes, so he shows us he knows where the Bible is.
So if kind of looking at the other side of things, if Trump had won, or if even there's some major court challenge and he's able to prevail, again, there's a lot of votes on the other side of this. I was thinking about this morning. I actually don't know that it changes our response all that much, in the sense that we should still be vigilant. And one of the concerns I've had about, it's not really a concern about the Trump presidency, but just something I've noticed from Christians is just like, well, if somebody that we think has our back is in office, we can just unplug from public life, not worry about it.
I have seen that in my career. I'm a couple steps ahead of you, as you observed, Josh. When Ronald Reagan was in the Oval Office, we're okay. George Bush, oh, we're okay. Donald Trump, he's got our back. And there's an element of truth to that. But this is not a, you know, in and out kind of thing. This, our citizenship, we're stewards of this great responsibility we have to cast a vote. We pay taxes, and it's not like, you know, it's like rearing a child. You know, when the child's born, you've got 20 years or so ahead of you. And when you become an American citizen, whether through immigration or by birth, you know, you don't just pick and choose and kind of get in and I'll vote this year, but not next year. It's an ongoing commitment and responsibility to steward that part of your public life that you have control over. And it's quite a gift that we have that control and we have that privilege. But it's not an in and out kind of thing. You got to be there for all the contests and questions.
So I appreciate that. And that is the word. I look at citizenship as stewardship the same way. And so if there is something that comes out of it, and I try to, on the podcast, just, all right, what's reality? I could wish for lots of different things, but
Yeah.
what's reality? And perhaps one of the things that will come out of this is many Christians that may have been tempted to just kind of kick back will remain engaged.
Yeah.
So we've talked.
It's probably fair to say, we don't have all the data in yet, that at least 30% of evangelical Christians didn't register and didn't vote. And you look at how close this election is, if just 2 or 3% more had done that. And I hope church leaders know that they can register their people. That's not a political act. That's a citizenship act. And, you know, maybe they could do it in a non-political season, so it doesn't appear that they're trying to run the numbers up for one side or another. But for church leaders, pastors especially, to encourage their people to be registered and to vote is an act of stewardship, not an act of political activism. And I would hope all church leaders listening would take note of that. It's very easy to register. You know, there's lots of resources and help, from the Alliance Defending Freedom to the Family Institute to the Daniel Initiative. We'll help people do it in the right way that honors the gospel, that adheres to all the applicable laws. But it's really important for the church to be engaged and to speak up. And if only 20% had not voted instead of 30, then this election would be very different.
And that's something I've been thinking about for a very long time, about just the church being the church and how that can have profound effects on the future of the country.
Yeah. We've shied away from politics for some understandable reasons, and it's become more contentious and more difficult. But that doesn't mean we just cede the battlefield, that section of the battlefield, to the other side. The gospel calls us to be engaged everywhere in the battle for ideas and political engagement, in the universities, the media, and certainly in our own churches and congregations.
So you mentioned the Senate just in passing, and it appears that race is going to go to a runoff election. Any thoughts on that race and the importance of the Senate?
The Senate's very important. Obviously, each chamber of the lawmaking process matters, but the Senate has some unique roles that are kind of more important in this time. As Senator Todd Young of Indiana says, they're the HR department, and so they approve a lot of the appointments. So every cabinet secretary, every judge, every ambassador, every key official in a new administration, whether it's a Trump or a Biden, must go through the Senate and win approval. And so if it remains in more conservative hands, the kind of person nominated will be a little different than if it's clearly, you know, one partisan side has an advantage versus the other. If it's balanced, I think we'll get more balanced candidates for those kinds of offices. And then the way the Senate works now, it could change, and that's part of the problem. Is there's been some rather dramatic statements made, but the Senate has this tradition. I used to work there, and this is one of the harder things to understand, but it's called the filibuster, and it's been modified in recent years. But right now, for a legislative proposal to go through, with the exception of the budget, it needs 60 votes. That's just, the Senate said in its early days, we're going to be a deliberative body. We're going to work on persuasion. We're going to require a supermajority for anything significant. And if that stays, it's called the legislative filibuster, then it's going to be very hard for any of these sweeping Green New Deal or the Equality Act or some of the more admitting 2 new states to the Union, District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, which would give 4 liberal senators over on the other side. None of those things go forward if the Senate is a 51 Republican, 49 Democrat. Now, again, I hate to get partisan, but that's just the math. That's just how it works. You could call it conservative and progressive. So it comes down to these 2 seats in Georgia. Now, I'm not willing to just say today that I think they're both going to be in the runoff. Florida, or Georgia rather, has a unique law. They passed it, I think, in 90, and you must win 50% of the vote for a statewide office, governor, U.S. senator, et cetera. And one of the 2 incumbents is just a whisker below that. And there are some math issues and counting errors, which is not all that uncommon in Georgia, but there's 132 ballots, 32,000 ballots that are being disputed. And so the one incumbent, Purdue, might eke out a win. But either way, we're going to have this runoff in Georgia, and it could come down to the Senate is 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and January 5th, we'll have 2 elections simultaneously in Georgia for these 2 Senate seats. It'll be crazy. I would bet on the Republicans. They've won every runoff in Georgia since this new law in the early 90s. We saw a couple races around the country where interest groups put in $100 million in Kentucky and South Carolina to defeat an incumbent, and it didn't work. So I'm not sure you can buy these seats. I think the public's pretty sophisticated. They see through the negative ads. And but it could all come down to 15 days before we inaugurate a new president. We're finding out what the status of the Senate is.
That's helpful. And just the knowledge there, it'll be interesting to see how much money gets poured into those races if South Carolina is any indicator.
Some of the wits on Twitter and elsewhere are saying, I wish I'd invested in TV stations in Georgia, because there's going to be millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm hoping Purdue ekes out a win just for lots of reasons. It makes it 51 right away and takes some of the energy out. But it also means that we won't just have a crazy campaign down there with all kinds of mudslinging and tough stuff.
And just on a lighter side, I'm sure all of the the citizens in Georgia are like, "Oh no,
oh no,
we got like a Christmas commercial, and then some more mudslinging. Here we go."
Yeah. Well, Hallmark ratings, Hallmark Channel ratings may go up. I don't think they accept political ads, so they may have a lot of extra viewers in Georgia.
So one of the encouraging developments that I saw, and I wanted to frame this up carefully, and that is the goal of Christian citizenship, certainly our engagement, is to see the church be the church. And then when it steps into the public square, it does so promoting biblical values. And it doesn't really matter which party or which candidate is going to promote those. It is, do you promote them? And so what I'm about to say may sound a bit partisan, but it's truly, I think, a reflection of something developing that may indicate that sort of future for our public witness. So I saw it as encouraging, because our culture right now says you have to vote along kind of racial and tribal lines. And there were some developments with religious voters this election that seemed like Christians are willing to kind of put that aside and say, all right, biblical values first. And so for those listening that, you're getting a little nervous about this, understand the sentiment here. It is about Christians voting biblical values first. So would you mention some of those developments?
Sure. I think the most significant is the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote. In Florida and along the border in Texas, there were dramatic changes. Some would say in Florida it was the Cuba vote. There are a lot of very anti-communist Cubans, first or second generation, who suffered or their families suffered under communism in Cuba. And so they've been very tuned into foreign policy and those issues. And President-elect Biden didn't take as strong a stand as President Trump did on those issues. But when you look along the Texas border, Hillary Clinton in 2016 had 90 to 10, 80 to 20 margins among Latino voters, and Trump cut those almost even. Not quite, but it's like 54 to 46. So Biden still has a plurality, but that's a really big shift. And it appears that a lot of Latinos who identify as Catholics voted for President Trump because of the life issue and because of economic concerns. are somewhat tied up in the COVID pandemic. They fear the economy being shut down again. They were concerned about what would happen to laborers and workers. Many of them are involved in the essential industries, meatpacking and others that were up and running. But still, they feared that the government would come along again under President Biden and shut things down. So that's very interesting to see. The vote for among religious groups in the early data stayed fairly stable. About 30% of Jewish voters supported Trump, 35% of Muslim voters went for Trump, 50-50 on Catholics, although we're going to have to count the Latino vote very carefully. Then evangelicals, one poll had them at 81, which is similar to 2016, another at 75%. So fairly stable when you just use religion as an identifier. But it does appear that underneath those numbers, Latinos are more open to the Republican message of religious liberty, pro-life, and a strong economy, again, to put a political label on it.
And so it's a little early to tell, but again, I'm just looking at this vision of the church voting as the church rather than kind of the parties telling us, okay, you've got to segregate yourselves. And so, again, a little early to tell, but I thought there was at least a bit of a hint of that in some of the numbers. And so I'm certainly grateful for that, and we'll continue just to push that forward.
There was also the beginnings of a little change in the African-American vote, not as pronounced as the Latino vote. I think President Trump got 8% in 2016. Some exit polls suggest he got 15, 16, 17%. And those would be a lot of urban voters, inner city voters, especially African-American men. And when you change that vote, it's kind of a twofer. You know, if you get a guy in Wisconsin off the couch to go register and vote, you might gain a vote. But if you take a voter who is going to be for Biden and move him over to Trump, it's a twofer. He loses one, this one gains one. So those are big changes, and trend worth watching. See if the Conservative Party can continue to have a message that resonates with a broad swath of American public life.
And so that certainly would just be the point here. And there would be some Christians that are like, well, how dare you vote for Trump, et cetera. We talk a lot about Romans 13 being followed by Romans 14 and Christian liberty. Again, the vision of our effort is to see the church being the church rather than being kind of separated by the parties, and us just having a voice. So
we want to vote on issues and public policy and let the personalities kind of fight it out.
Sure. One other claim that I've heard for years, and I know you've heard it much longer than I have, and just in our conversations, but this message that, well, just give it a little time, and the demographic shifts in our country are going to turn America towards this more progressive, what I might say, unbiblical worldview, and that it's just inevitable. So why don't you guys just give up and kind of throw in the towel? And I hear that from Christians from time to time. So what are your thoughts on that? Just looking at these election results, and also kind of as you're looking towards the future, that argument on it's just inevitable, what are you seeing?
I don't think it's inevitable at all. And again, as an optimist, I can see some data points in this election at this early stage that argue against that. Again, the Latino vote changed, African-American vote changed. The COVID pandemic has upended a lot of things. And I think it's causing people to pause and think about, what are my freedoms and what's the limit, and do I have to wear a mask? And it's created just a whole different conversation. This pandemic is a major event, and it will affect politics. And I'm not sure it will all benefit the more progressive worldview of stronger government control, top-down planning, those kinds of characteristics. But especially the change in the Latino vote. Republican strategists have long wondered, why don't we do better with Latino vote? It's a very committed religious community, very pro-family, pro-life generally, which would go with that kind of a faith commitment. And Trump may have broken through. Perhaps on the economy, things were very good before the pandemic descended on us at the beginning of 2020. And it's not inevitable. There's a lot of back and forth, and the parties have to offer ideas and solutions. And it's not a static situation where here's your part of the pie and you can't ever grow it or change your views. It's a more dynamic back and forth. And while you mentioned earlier, maybe if we had a parliamentary system, it'd be a little easier to get some of our answers. One advantage of the American system, this binary A or B, is we get answers and they're definitive for a time. Nothing's forever, but for a time. And parties change and they go back and forth and they steal each other's constituency and they make a higher bid, so to speak, for a vote or a position. And I see the Republicans very craftily navigating that area. All the House seats that they gained this year, it's 5 today, it may be as many as 15, probably settle somewhere in that 10 range. It was a woman, it was a minority, or it was a veteran candidate. So the Republican Party is getting better at recruiting grassroots people who are going to be popular in a congressional district in this example. And I don't think there's any inevitability to it. They said that after Ronald Reagan, you know, the WASP, there's an expression that's gone, but a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you know, we're kind of on a downhill thing. Dan Quayle was on the ticket with George H.W. Bush because he represented the new, younger, and they served one term. And it's just not happening that way. People are too sophisticated and the parties are too responsive.
That's really helpful. Just an encouragement to me, as hopefully to the listeners as well. And we can kind of sit here, you kind of wring your hands, well, the future's already predetermined. No, it's not. You know,
Not at
God
all.
is at work in our times. We don't always know exactly how he's doing that, but it's an exciting time to be alive. And if we will promote a biblical platform, which we've set out at length, which includes things like racial unity and justice, but doing
Absolutely.
so in a biblical way, I believe that there's a lot of room there. And again, this idea that we're going to turn into just a completely secular state where religion's gone, that's not happening either. So
No.
I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I appreciate your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to be optimistic about. And, you know, God is at work. And not only is he at work, but he invites us to be a part of that work. And what an honor, what a privilege. And the public square is only a piece. You know, our larger and higher callings are often in our families or in our professional engagements. But all of us have this responsibility. And if you think about your taxes, on overall in the whole economy, government takes 40% of our income. So I don't think we need to give government 40% of our time and attention, but we want to be checking up on that investment because we're going to
Sure.
give an account to the Lord when we go to heaven, what happened with those tax dollars. And I'm grateful for God's grace because I got a lot of explaining to do, but hopefully I have a little less explaining to do because of my political engagement on where the tax dollars went.
Right then. Well, there was a lot of optimism right before that. And the thought that 40% of my income's going to government. No, but
Yeah.
it's part of the
Well, that's
argument
at
that we
all
need to
levels.
be.
So
Yeah,
that's the bridge and the police officer and the
sure,
submarine.
sure. Well, Curt, and I appreciate your thoughts. And I think the listeners can hear just, we could go on and on and on. You've got all these stats and just where things are going. And so just a kind of final question for you today is, you know, if you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the church, especially in these difficult times with COVID-19, elections, a new outbreak of COVID, what would that statement be?
I would say, let the church be the church. My longtime pastor, Howard Brammer, used to say that. And as an elder and later chairman of the board of elders, I always took comfort in that. Just let the church be the church. And sometimes it was a small thing. So somebody's going to take food to this person because they're having a baby or they're sick or something. But
Mm.
other times it was major things related to the Billy Graham crusade coming to Indianapolis or other different contexts. But just let the church be the church. This is God's solution. This is what he left. Christ said, I go that the Spirit will come, and you're more benefited if I leave so the Holy Spirit can come. So let the church be the church as the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. And we'll see good things happen, maybe not as quickly as we want, maybe not in exactly the way we want, but that too could be God's grace.
Amen. Well, I appreciate your experience and bringing your thoughts to us today. It's certainly been helpful to
My
me as
pleasure.
I'm,
Well,
you know,
thanks for
just,
having me on the show.
yes. And especially as listeners are processing this, if you'd like to learn more about Curt, you can go to the Indiana Family Institute website, who'syourfamily.org. Curt has also written a book, Deicide, which explains much of what he's talked about here today. And you can also find the book on the website. So thanks again, Curt, for taking a few minutes today.
My pleasure. Take care.